Terrific. I think that the slides are being presented for me remotely. Is that correct?
That's correct. So they're being loaded as we speak.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. As will be seen in the slides, I don't know if the slides are up. I don't see them, but
here they are.
In any event,
got them. Thanks.
Good.
Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, next slide. So I am I'm in charge of global medical affairs at Merck. I'm an employee of Merck, and I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that for my presentation. What I thought I would do, if you go to the next slide, is to review the 3 stages of a drug development from the perspective of a pharmaceutical company. As we thought about HPV vaccine, which is my area of the talk, we thought we've thought about all the steps that are necessary to actually get this into get a product into implementation, and that includes regulatory requirements, payer requirements, and then implementation through various obstacles that are presented by routine care and care delivery pathways. So if we go to the next slide, just as a background for the HPV vaccine, I'm going to show you a slide of the natural history. It's a long chronic infection. The initial infection is not symptomatic, but it's extremely common. Most HPV infections are cleared or cause low-grade cervical dysplasia. But in some patients, almost immediately, one develops the precancerous lesions called cervical intraepithelial neoplasia grade 2 or 3, or adenocarcinoma in situ, which then requires some second hit some period of time later to emerge as cancer. The clinical trials program was designed not to focus so much on prevention of infection, although obviously that was an early endpoint, but to actually focus on the prevention of lesions as close as possible to cancer, because in essence, this was a vaccine to prevent cancer. And that required a tremendous amount of commitment on the part of the company and was not an obvious thing to do, as most vaccines are developed to prevent the infections against the pathogens in the vaccine. So if you go to the next slide, for the HPV vaccine itself, we thought hard about which vaccine would be most attractive to ministries of health and payers, to providers in the general population. And in order to do that, we need to understand how and when will the impact of the vaccine be felt. And we also had to work hard to develop the body of knowledge that would serve as the basis for the clinical trials program, and to develop a strategy that would balance scientific certainty, timelines, and financial risk. There was also an extra added issue here because we understood from the get-go that this was an STI, and we wanted to make sure that we understood implementation right from the beginning, including addressing some key questions about the people who would get vaccinated, who are the decision makers at the national provider and family levels, and what are their data needs, how to place the vaccine within current practice, i.e. PAP testing, and how to engage pediatricians given the age of infection, mode of transmission. What does the general public know about HPV, and what do they need to know to understand why vaccination makes sense? And then right up front to address issues of stigma and cultural sensitivity. We also had to think hard about demand because factories for vaccines are extraordinarily expensive and usually have a very long runway from initial conception and groundbreaking to the ability to actually supply for human use. Next slide. The first thing for us was to try to understand which vaccine would be relevant for the public health authorities. And as a quick background, there are over 40 HPV types that infect humans, but among those, 4 cause the majority of disease. HPV 16 and 18 cause 70% of cervical cancer and other HPV-related cancers. HPV 6 and 11 cause over 90% of genital warts, which are not fatal, not life-threatening, but really embarrassing, have a high incidence, and impact people quite severely in terms of a very difficult treatment. So the question that we faced was, do we focus on 16 and 18, which are the cancer vaccines, or do we include HPV or cancer types, or should we include 6 and 11? This question was not inconsequential because the competitor vaccine ended up focusing on 16 and 18 only. We decided to do a quadrivalent vaccine to start because we wanted a broader coverage. We wanted an immediate benefit to recipients, which would really help because we were concerned about young adults and their thinking about the long term. We wanted to make sure that we got benefits for the payers right up front and make something that would be attractive to both genders. It came at a cost, of course, because the clinical program was much more complex. The manufacturing was complex. We had to build a larger factory because the amount of material was double for 16-18 vaccine, and we had to grapple with the problem of genital warts and how to think about that. So if you go to the next slide, we immediately focused on. We immediately decided to take our program in a slightly different way than a typical vaccine program, and to have a clinical and research and regulatory track and an implementation track that fed each other, one with emerging data and others with stakeholder needs. The track on the left is the traditional track, which is, figuring out the information needed to design phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical programs, selecting the proper efficacy endpoints, and then monitoring the efficacy of the vaccine, including long-term safety and efficacy and real-world evidence, and staging the investment properly. The implementation track was a much bigger track than we typically do, which was to focus on who are the stakeholders for this vaccine, who would care about HPV prevention and cancer prevention, and were they the same or different than those who were traditional advocates for vaccines. We wanted to think about proofs of efficacy that would be needed to enable prioritization within national health strategies. This was a different vaccine because this is not a pediatric disease. And then we wanted to figure out which data would be most compelling and what gaps were present that we could fill. We wanted to understand fears and worries. And again, we wanted to make sure that we understood what people's perceptions were of the target population. Health economics is always important because, of course, the funding mechanism requires it. If you go to the next slide, the implementation team gave us foundational information that led to the development of what ended up being a fairly successful program. Governments told us repeatedly that they wanted to show efficacy against hard endpoints, not just infection, but something that's meaningful and that causes quality of life decrement to patients, and that it was highly indicative of cancer. They wanted to see durability of efficacy. They didn't want just girls to be vaccinated because they were worried about gender equity issues. There was a worry that the vaccine would be expensive. Gynecologists and pathologists were enthusiastic about the vaccine, but they also didn't want to disturb what had been an important public health, what has continued to be an important public health intervention, that is Pap testing or HPV screening. Civic, religious, and advocacy groups were approached, and we developed an important collaboration with them because we wanted to hear what were the worries that they might have. And this is vaccine was developed in a time when, in the United States, culture wars had started to break out. Abstinence education was an important question that was being addressed. And we wanted to make sure that we balanced the needs and the concerns of a variety of stakeholders in the public space. We also wanted to understand, talk to pediatricians and recognize that they're really uncomfortable about talking about sex. And we needed to help them understand how to speak about HPV, both to moms and to the kids. And that led to changes in the clinical program to focus on hard endpoints, to have our Scandinavian Cancer Registry program that followed people out for a period of about 15 years, to bring forward the male program, to focus on genital warts and invasive procedures in front of payers because they would derive maximal benefit from the cost savings associated with these problems, with these procedures, focus on burden of disease, and then encourage or conduct studies to understand teen decisions about sexual debut, create a communication strategy that addressed the questions and concerns of public organizations and people in the public space. And then realize that, cancer prevention was highly, highly valued. So we immediately initiated development of a 9-valent vaccine to try to cover up to 90% of HPV cancer-causing types. Next slide. The clinical program has lasted now 20 years. It's been over 50,000 subjects. It was quite expensive, but we had to create all of the assays and all of the ways in which we track HPV and the attribution of HPV types to precancer and cancerous lesions. I'll point out to the start of the factory construction in 2000, well before we knew anything about the long-term durability of the vaccine. There was a huge financial gamble, but it was necessary in order to reach at least modest supply. We followed patients through Scandinavia, the Scandinavian registry system, for years, and did studies in other patient populations, including adolescents, which ended up being the primary population of vaccination, as well as women who were between 24 and 45. Next slide. And so, reflections, I wanted to focus to tell you a little bit about what the success factors were and what the challenges were. There were some seminal studies that were conducted by academic researchers just prior to the start of our phase 3 program, and our placebo arm ended up being a really important part of that. And so the University of Washington, Laura Kautsky, and others in King Holmes group at the time were instrumental in helping us understand when SIN-2-3 appears. We committed to hard endpoints right from the get-go so that countries would understand that this vaccine really will prevent cancer. It was really one of the most expensive clinical trials program that Merck had conducted at the time. We were aided by governments in Scandinavia who have extraordinary registries, and that investment in being able to track people through their lives and to understand burdens of disease was instrumental in the development of this vaccine. Long-term effectiveness studies were conducted through that system. We had a lot of stakeholder engagement and clear, consistent, and frequent communication. We weren't 100% successful in our efforts. We should have started the male program much earlier, including the head and neck cancer program, which now will start. We got ahead of the consensus in the early days and got too enthusiastic about implementation, which led to a lot of backlash. We underestimated the difficulty in vaccinating teens, especially in the U.S. The vaccine still became a lightning rod for vaccine hesitancy. We missed the demand inflection point, which has led to shortages now, and we're building a bunch of factories to make that happen, to make that go away. And as over the years, we've noticed more barriers to coordination with government that has actually slowed down the vaccine development process. So at the end, I'd just like to focus on what's needed for a successful STI vaccine program from my personal point of view. STI vaccines will always be subjected to higher standard of versus infections acquired by involuntary contact. There's always a blame game here, and so you need to look at harder endpoints. In the case of chlamydia, for example, if we were ever to develop a vaccine, we would focus not on prevention of the acute urethritis, but on prevention of symptomatic PID and infertility, even if it meant very long studies. We absolutely need to do durability and safety and be ready for the vaccine hesitancy movement. We need endpoints that are meaningful to payers. Near-term cost benefit is critical, especially that the benefit accrues to the payer who's funding the vaccination program. And then work with stakeholders. We couldn't do it all by ourselves. We needed to build consensus around why HPV vaccination and who would benefit and how to address some questions about sexual behavior. And it's important to have public-private coordination. We know that that we're separate and there needs to be barriers, but these programs really require a lot of infrastructural investment from governments to understand the burden of disease, to be able to quickly measure the impact of the vaccine, to help create the political will to tackle these STIs. And so with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barr. And we appreciate you and Dr. Perros being able to hang on just for our last speaker, unless you're time constrained.
Nope, we're there.
Great, fantastic.